Everyone thinks the next financial collapse will start in China. But the truth is, it's a race, and the US might be winning it. You've heard the headlines: Evergrande defaults, local governments drowning in debt, youth unemployment hits 20%. The official narrative paints China as the world's fragile giant, one bad quarter away from implosion. But beneath the panic, there's a strange silence about something much closer to home, something more mathematically dangerous. Because while China is burying its crisis behind state secrecy and command economics, the US is broadcasting its collapse in plain English, on Treasury websites, in budget proposals, in debt auctions. In 2024, America paid over $1 trillion just in interest, not on building anything, not on education, not on defense, just interest. And that number is rising. So here's the paradox. The free market economy of the West is collapsing faster than the centrally planned economy of the East. Not because of ideology, but because of time. Because both systems made the same gamble, and the numbers are running out at the same moment. This isn't about politics, it's about structure. China built ghost cities. America built ghost debt. One stacked up useless real estate. The other stacked up claims on future wealth that no longer exists. And both of them, under all the public statements, the growth forecasts, the GDP optimism, are trapped in the same machine: debt-driven expansion with no real productivity to back it up. It worked for a while, for both, and then arithmetic showed up. See, credit is a drug. For empires, it's the most addictive one. It gives the illusion of strength, until suddenly it doesn't. If you're hearing this in 2025, you're inside the final sprint. The US debt ceiling is no longer a ceiling, it's a moving target. China's economy is still growing, but slowing in all the wrong places. And both governments are now doing the same thing, printing promises, hoping reality won't notice. But reality always notices. It did in 1929, it did in 2008, it did in 1789 in France when the collapse of the assignat currency wiped out a monarchy. They said it was a revolution. It was a debt default. Today the slogans are different, but the pattern is the same. Because systems don't collapse because of bad intentions. They collapse when numbers outgrow gold, real income, or trust. Before a collapse, there's always a blueprint. None of what's happening in 2025 is random. Not the $34 trillion US debt, not China's hidden shadow banks, not the rising interest costs, the manipulated statistics, or the desperate search for soft landings. These aren't glitches in the system. They are the system. And to understand this race to collapse, we have to go back. Not to 2008, not even to 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, but to the very moment when money stopped being real and started being a belief system. 1944, Bretton Woods. The US had just won the war. Europe was ruined. China was still under Japanese occupation. And for the first time in history, one country, America, owned most of the world's gold and most of the world's productive capacity. So the dollar became king, officially. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar. And the dollar? Pegged to gold, $35 an ounce. A simple promise, backed by 20,000 metric tons of American gold reserves sitting at Fort Knox. But even then, the clock was ticking. Because once you give a country the power to issue the global reserve currency, while also letting it run deficits, you've created a paradox. The US had to print dollars to help the world grow, but printing too many would eventually make that dollar worthless. This was called the Triffin dilemma, and every economist who mattered saw it coming. Still, America printed. For Vietnam, for the Great Society, for Cold War defense. Dollars flowed out, and gold started to flow back in the other direction, to France, to Germany, to Switzerland, anyone who could do math. By 1971, there wasn't enough gold left to honor the promises, so Nixon defaulted, quietly. He called it temporarily suspending convertibility, but let's not lie to ourselves. That was the moment the world entered a new phase, pure fiat. Pure trust. And this is where the system China inherited and eventually tried to outplay really began. Because after 1971, there was no break. no anchor. The U.S. could borrow forever. So it did. And in doing so, it exported that same logic to everyone else, to allies, to enemies, to future rivals. China watched, slowly, carefully. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping opened the door. Not wide, just enough to let capital in. China began to play the global game. By the 1990s, it was the cheap factory of the West. By the 2000s, it was building cities at breakneck speed, all powered by the same mechanism: debt for growth, leverage for illusion. The Chinese state didn't copy American democracy. It copied the American credit machine, but added its own twist: central command. While the U.S. debt ballooned through Congress and consumption, China's debt grew through state-owned banks and construction. While the U.S. printed for welfare and war, China printed for roads and rail. Same drug, different syringe. Both became addicted, and both believed, for a while, that they could manage the high forever, that growth would catch up to the borrowing, that productivity would fill the gap, that this time is different. It never is. By the 2010s, America had passed $20 trillion in debt. China had passed 300% debt to GDP, if you count the off-books local financing. And neither could stop, because stopping meant collapse. This wasn't just bad policy, it was baked into the architecture. The modern monetary system rewards debt. It punishes saving. It needs expansion to survive, like a shark that can't stop swimming. If growth slows, the system buckles. If interest rates rise, the system screams. And if trust vanishes, it dies. The men who built this world, Bretton Woods, the Fed, the IMF, the People's Bank of China, weren't fools. They just played a long game, thinking they'd retire before the music stopped. But the music's still playing, louder than ever, and the chairs are getting fewer. 2026 isn't some arbitrary date. It's the convergence point. Because the US and China are now locked in the same trap, but from opposite sides. One can't stop borrowing, the other can't stop building. Both depend on lies about value, and both will be forced to choose: hyperinflation or controlled demolition. Just like France in 1789, just like the British Empire in 1931, just like Argentina, Venezuela, Rome. Different flags, same numbers. And numbers don't negotiate. There's a strange moment in every empire's story when things feel too good to question. That's how you know the fall is close. For the US, that moment came after 2008. For China, it came right after 2010. Both countries had just survived what should have been a system-ending event, and instead, they came out richer, stronger, and more confident than ever. But it was a trick, a beautiful one, built on leverage, liquidity, and the oldest lie in money. We can grow our way out of debt. Let's look at America first. After the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve cut rates to near zero and launched quantitative easing. It sounds complicated, but it's really just this. The Fed printed money and bought debt, government bonds, mortgage securities, anything to keep the system afloat. At first, it felt like salvation. Stocks soared. Housing recovered. Tech exploded. Suddenly, the U.S. had trillion-dollar companies that didn't exist 10 years earlier. Apple, Google, Amazon, Tesla. It looked like capitalism had reinvented itself. But underneath, the foundation was fake. The U.S. didn't fix the problem of debt. It doubled down. By 2012, national debt passed $16 trillion. By 2020, it was over $23 trillion. Then COVID hit, and all brakes were removed. Trillions more were printed. Stimulus checks, bailouts, PPP loans. The Fed's balance sheet exploded past $8 trillion. And still, everyone said the same thing: the system works. The markets went up, inflation stayed down for a while. The illusion held. Meanwhile, China was having its own miracle. In 2009, while Wall Street was burning, Beijing did something bold. It launched the largest infrastructure stimulus in human history, $586 billion in direct spending, with trillions more flowing through state-owned banks and local governments. New highways, bullet trains, entire cities built from scratch. For a brief moment, the world believed. China had cracked the code. Western analysts flew into Shanghai and Shenzhen and called it the China century. GDP hit 10% annual growth. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Steel, cement, copper, all surged. A whole economy built on pouring concrete and raising skylines. But again, it was debt. Local governments borrowed from off-book local government financing vehicles, shadowy structures that acted like banks but weren't on the books. By 2015, Chinese debt had ballooned to over 250% of GDP. By 2020, estimates pushed that above 300%, most of it hidden, most of it unpayable. Still, the illusion held. For a while, it felt like both sides had won. The US controlled the reserve currency, China controlled the factories. One consumed, one produced. Dollars flowed east, goods flowed west. Wall Street made billions. The party stayed in power. It looked like perfect balance. But it was actually perfect codependence, like two addicts holding each other up. The US needed cheap imports to keep inflation down, especially as wages stagnated and real productivity faltered. China needed US dollars to fuel its export machine and keep millions employed, especially as its own domestic consumption lagged behind. So the cycle fed itself. The Fed printed, Beijing lent, Wall Street cheered, and every time there was a wobble, a mini crisis, a slowdown, a bank failure, more money was injected. Zero interest rates became normal. Asset bubbles were seen as economic strength, and anyone who warned of collapse was dismissed as paranoid. It's the same thing that happened in 1720 with the South Sea Bubble, in 1927 before the Great Depression, in 2006 before the housing crash. Booms make people blind. In China, ghost cities were built not to house people, but to satisfy GDP targets. Entire apartment blocks stood empty, but counted as growth. In America, zombie companies, unprofitable firms that only survived because of cheap debt, multiplied. By 2022, it was obvious. Both empires had passed the point of rational economics. The US couldn't raise interest rates without blowing up its own budget. China couldn't slow construction without triggering mass defaults and unemployment. But instead of course correction, they both chose the same path. More debt, more delay, more illusion. They convinced the world it was under control. They convinced themselves. Because when systems are this big, when the stakes are this high, nobody wants to be the one to say, stop. And so the race continued, toward 2026, toward the point where growth can no longer hide the cost of the past, toward the moment when belief stops working, because belief is not a strategy, and arithmetic always wins. Illusions can last a long time, until they meet a number that won't move. By 2025, both the US and China had run out of room to pretend, not because of ideology, not because of war, because of simple arithmetic. Here's what that looks like when the mask comes off. The US Treasury was paying over $1 trillion a year in interest on the national debt. That's more than it spends on defense, more than Medicaid, more than education. And that's before the next round of rate hikes. This wasn't politics anymore. This was math. Because every time the Fed raised interest rates, even a little, the cost of refinancing old debt exploded. And remember, the US doesn't borrow once and pay it off. It rolls over its debt constantly. Short-term bills, long-term bonds, all priced at the interest rate of now, not yesterday. In 2023, a 10-year Treasury yielded 3.5%. By 2025, that number had crossed 5%. For a $34 trillion debt load, that's a death sentence over time. And yet they had no choice. If the Fed cut rates to relieve pressure, inflation roared back. If they raised rates to tame inflation, the budget collapsed. It was a trap of their own design. China faced the same reckoning from a different angle. Their entire growth model, built on endless infrastructure, cheap exports, and property speculation, hit a wall. Homebuyers vanished, developers defaulted, and the local governments that had banked on ever-rising land sales to fund their debts suddenly found the land worthless. One of China's largest developers, Evergrande, had already defaulted by 2021. By 2025, dozens more followed. Empty towers, broken loans, state bailouts that no longer covered the holes. The banks, especially the regional ones, were exposed, but too fragile to fail. So Beijing did what it always does. It centralized. It pushed the People's Bank of China to inject liquidity, quietly buy debt, prop up banks. But every yuan printed to fix the past weakened the future. Confidence began to crack, and in China, where control is everything, that's the final danger. Because unlike America, China's system runs on obedience, not votes. If people lose faith, they don't switch parties, they revolt. History remembers 1989, but few talk about 1949 or the 1930s hyperinflation under the Kuomintang. When belief broke, regimes fell, and belief was breaking. Even foreign investors began to see it. By mid-2025, capital flight from China was accelerating. U.S. Treasury auctions were stalling. BRICS countries started experimenting with alternatives to the dollar, and both superpowers were quietly, desperately, trying to delay the reckoning. How? Through what governments always do when they can't pay. They inflate. Inflation is default by another name. It's how debt is erased without saying the word bankruptcy. The U.S. began tolerating 4 to 5% annual inflation, officially. But unofficially, prices were rising faster. Food, energy, insurance, rent. They massaged the numbers, changed the basket, blamed supply chains, greed, weather. But everyone knew their savings were dying. China, for its part, didn't allow headline inflation, but internal prices were crumbling. The property you bought for $1 million now sold for $600K, if at all. The miracle economy had become a shell game. And all of this, every cut, every lie, every desperate measure, came from the same place. A system built on future promises that the present can no longer sustain. Because debt, by definition, is borrowing from tomorrow, and eventually tomorrow arrives. In 1789, the French crown printed assignats backed by confiscated church land, a desperate attempt to paper over a fiscal crisis. It worked for a year. Then the currency collapsed, food riots began, and the king lost his head. In 2025, we have better branding, quantitative easing, stimulus, modern monetary theory. But the math is the same. The U.S. can no longer fund its government without borrowing. China can no longer fund its growth without printing. And the world, the global economy that runs on both, is now caught in the middle. Because when two superpowers run out of credit at the same time, the collapse isn't local. It's systemic. There's no Lehman moment to blame. There's no singular villain. There's only a quiet unraveling of trust, of value, of the assumptions we've held for 40 years. The market doesn't scream. It stops believing. And that's when it ends. If you're watching this and you've ever been told, the debt doesn't matter, we owe it to ourselves, remember this. So did every failed empire, until the day the collectors came. Collapse isn't a moment, it's a process, and it always starts with silence. No fireworks, no speeches, just small things breaking, faster, more often, and closer to home. In 2025, the U.S. didn't announce a default, neither did China. That's not how major powers fall. Instead, we saw signs. Airlines quietly removing routes. Malls turning off escalators to save on electricity. Insurance companies pulling out of entire states. Banks reducing office hours. Cities temporarily suspending public services. Rent rising. Wages stagnating. And everywhere, the sense that things were still functioning, but barely. That's the modern shape of collapse. It's not the floor caving in, it's the ceiling slowly coming down. Let's call it what it is, a managed devaluation of life. In the U.S., debt service had already overtaken every major federal spending category. Social Security, Medicare, defense, all were being squeezed. Quietly, budget deals froze COLAs, or cost of living adjustments, raised retirement ages, delayed payments. Not by decree, but by bureaucracy. The U.S. couldn't default legally, so it defaulted socially. You were promised benefits, but they arrive later, or they buy less, or they're under review. That's a sovereign default with good manners. At the same time, inflation, even the official kind, stayed sticky. The Fed claimed victory when it dropped from 7% to 4%. But if your rent's up 30%, your groceries up 25%, and your health insurance doubled, Do you care? You already defaulted. Your life did. Meanwhile, China was facing its own mirror image. Empty cities became dead weight. Local governments, unable to roll over debt, were quietly absorbed by the central government. The iron rice bowl, lifelong government jobs, pensions, medical care, began to crack. Layoffs in the public sector hit provinces that had never seen them before. Beijing blamed global headwinds. But the truth was simpler. They built a future no one could afford to live in. Then came the protests. Nothing huge, nothing headline-grabbing, but everywhere, little bursts. Pensioners demanding payments, workers protesting unpaid wages, even party officials growing nervous as their own retirement funds came under threat. And in both countries, the solution was the same: surveillance, distraction, liquidity. When trust breaks, control rises. The U.S. launched its digital dollar pilot for convenience, they said. China pushed forward with its eCNY, programmable money tied to your behavior, your location, your loyalty score. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's policy. In a world where money is no longer real, the state must track your belief in it. They can't afford dissent because they can't afford for you to see the system naked, so they bury you in noise. GDP is still up. Markets are resilient. Unemployment is low. Everything's temporary. But here's the thing. The collapse isn't coming. It already came. When a system needs permanent debt to function, it's already bankrupt. When two global powers can't grow without printing, the growth is fake. When you need two jobs to stay in the same apartment, the currency has failed. They did it in Weimar Germany with wheelbarrows of cash. They do it now with silent theft through negative real interest rates. Different tools, same result. The 2026 debt event, whatever form it takes, a failed bond auction, a currency devaluation, a geopolitical flashpoint, won't begin the collapse. It will only reveal it. By then, capital will already have moved. Rules will already have changed. The system will have quietly picked winners and losers, and chances are you weren't invited to the winning side. Because systems don't fall all at once. They rot from the inside. And when that rot spreads far enough, the only thing left to do is explain it away. So they will. They'll say it was unforeseen. They'll blame inflation on war. They'll blame defaults on demographics. They'll say the system was too complex to predict. But you know better. This isn't complexity. It's fraud with equations. And the final stage is always the same. Shrink expectations, blame the people, and tighten the leash. If you felt it, not in headlines, but in your daily life, leave a comment. One thing that used to work that now doesn't. One promise you were given that quietly vanished. This is how we map the silent collapse, together. Empires don't collapse like towers. They collapse like faith, not with a bang, but with a shrug. Not when the money runs out, but when belief does. You don't wake up one day and find the dollar is worthless. You wake up one day and realize it already bought less. Your rent's up, your savings buy less, your future was mortgaged, and you never got the keys. This is how systems fall, not because of evil, but because of scale. Every empire thinks it can outgrow its own arithmetic, that it can borrow from tomorrow forever, that the laws of money are suggestions. But money, at its core, is trust in measurement. Once that measurement is distorted, when a dollar no longer measures value, when interest no longer measures risk, when GDP no longer measures prosperity, collapse is no longer a possibility. It's inevitable. America's error wasn't greed. China's error wasn't central planning. The error, in both cases, was assuming the machine could run on belief longer than it could run on production. That debts didn't need to be repaid, just managed. That the future would always be there to harvest. But the future is tired, and tired futures don't pay back trillion-dollar promises. So here we are. In a world where two superpowers are sprinting toward the same cliff, but still think they're racing each other. Where leaders still speak of growth targets, while the foundation gives way beneath them. We've been here before, in Rome, in Versailles, in Weimar. This time it just wears a sharper suit. This time it scrolls on your phone. Arithmetic can't be deceived. Gold doesn't care about ideology. and debt is just time, stolen and resold, until the clock strikes zero. You don't need to be a doomsayer, you just need to see the pattern. Because when governments lie about money, they eventually lie about everything else. And when trust goes, nothing works. Not banks, not borders, not ballots. History's warning is clear. Collapse doesn't punish bad people. It punishes unsustainable math. If this helped you see through the fog, share it with someone who still thinks the numbers are normal, or worse, that the system is stable. Because no matter which empire wins the race, the ground is already gone.